April 23rd, 1945. The Bavarian forest near Berchtesgaden. Kurt Schmidt, 17 years old, lay face down in cold mud that smelled of cordite and pine needles, his left leg screaming with a pain so absolute it had become a separate entity, louder than the American artillery that had torn through his Wehrmacht unit an hour earlier. The shrapnel had entered just below his knee, and when he looked down, which he tried not to do, he could see white bone gleaming through the torn fabric of his Feldgrau trousers. He had been a soldier for exactly 43 days. Around him, the forest exhaled smoke. The bark of ancient pines hung in strips where bullets had carved through them. His rifle lay 3 meters away, barrel bent, as useless as his leg. The other members of his unit, boys from his Hitler Youth Troop, promoted to soldiers when the Reich ran out of men, had scattered when the American tanks appeared. Kurt had stayed behind, not from courage, but from the simple physics of injury. When your leg won't carry you, running becomes impossible. He pressed his face into the earth and waited for death. They had told him what the Americans would do to captured German soldiers. They would torture him first, pull out his fingernails, cut off parts of his body. Then they would leave him to bleed out slowly, because Americans were savages, barely human, especially the dark-skinned ones who were less than animals. His Hitler Youth leader had shown them photographs, or what they were told were photographs, of mutilated German prisoners. "This is what waits for you if you surrender," the leader had said. "Better to die fighting than fall into their hands." The forest grew quiet except for distant engine sounds. Kurt tried to move his leg and darkness swallowed the edges of his vision. When it receded, he found himself looking at a pair of boots. American boots, brown leather, clean despite the mud, laced with precision. "Holy Christ," a voice said in English. "Medic, we got a kid here bleeding out." Kurt understood English. His mother had been a teacher before the war, had insisted he learn it, though after 1933 they had stopped speaking it at home. He understood the words but not their tone. There was no cruelty in the voice, no pleasure, just something that sounded almost like concern. Hands lifted him. He thrashed weakly, tried to pull away, managed only to make the pain worse. "Easy, son," another voice said. "We got you. You're gonna be okay." Lies, Kurt thought. They're lying to make me docile before they begin. But they carried him to a jeep with unexpected gentleness, laid him on a stretcher, began cutting away his trouser leg. An American medic, Jewish, Kurt could tell from the name stenciled on his bag, Goldstein, injected something into his arm. "Morphine," the medic said in fractured German. "For pain, you understand." Kurt waited for the poison to kill him. Instead, the agony in his leg diminished to a distant throb. The world softened at its edges. Through the narcotic haze, he watched American soldiers work on him with quick professional movements, wrapping his leg, checking his pulse, hooking up something they called plasma. No one struck him. No one cursed at him. The Jewish medic had kind eyes. They drove him to a field hospital, an actual hospital, with white tents and surgical equipment. Not a ditch where they would leave him to die. The morphine made everything strange and liquid, but he remembered the moment they carried him into the surgical tent, the moment that would fracture his understanding of the world more completely than any propaganda film or Hitler Youth lecture ever had. There were other wounded men on stretchers, American soldiers, German prisoners, even what looked like a British pilot. They lay side by side in a rough triage arrangement, and standing at the entrance to the surgical tent was a Negro sergeant, the first Kurt had ever seen in person, checking a clipboard, deciding the order of treatment. The sergeant looked at Kurt's leg, at the blood-soaked bandages, at Kurt's face. "This one next," he said. "Kid's lost too much blood." "What about Reynolds?" someone asked. "Reynolds can wait 20 minutes. This kid can't. They carried Kurt past an American soldier with a chest wound who offered him a thumbs up and a weak smile, past a British pilot with burns on his hands, into the surgical tent where a doctor, a woman impossibly, an American woman doctor, was scrubbing her hands. German prisoner, the Negro sergeant said, 17 years old, shrapnel to the left tibia with significant bone damage, blood loss approximately 2 pints, vitals stable after plasma, no other apparent injuries. The doctor turned. She was perhaps 40, with gray-streaked hair tied back under a surgical cap, and she looked at Kurt with the same professional assessment she might give any patient. "Get him on the table. Let's save that leg." Kurt tried to speak, to ask why they were doing this, why they weren't letting him die, or torturing him first. But the morphine had loosened his tongue while simultaneously making his thoughts too large and complex to fit through his mouth. The woman doctor leaned over him, smiled slightly. "You're going to be fine," she said in careful German. "I'm Dr. Williams. We're going to put you to sleep now and fix your leg. When you wake up, you'll be in a recovery tent. Try to relax." Someone placed a mask over his face. The last thing Kurt saw before the anesthesia took him was the Negro sergeant standing in the doorway, still checking his clipboard, still deciding who would live and in what order, making those decisions based on severity of injury rather than uniform or flag or the color of skin. Everything Kurt had been taught for 12 years dissolved in that moment like sugar in rain. Part 2. The Education of Children. In the autumn of 1945, Germany lay not just defeated but fundamentally broken in ways that transcended military surrender. The cities were landscapes of rubble where children played hide-and-seek among the corpses of buildings. The countryside had been stripped bare by retreating armies and advancing ones, by desperate civilians and occupation forces. But worse than the physical destruction was the pedagogical wasteland. An entire generation of children had been educated in schools, designed to produce not citizens but racial warriors, not thinkers but believers in a poisonous mythology that had just consumed their nation in fire. 68% of school buildings in the American occupation zone were damaged or destroyed. 19,000 teachers had been removed from their positions due to Nazi Party membership. Every textbook printed since 1933, mathematics books that taught children to calculate bomb trajectories, geography books that marked territories for future conquest, biology, texts that presented scientific racism as fact, had to be destroyed. What remained was an educational void into which 4.5 million children between the ages of 6 and 18 might fall, might grow up illiterate and bitter and ready to embrace the next demagogue who promised to restore their wounded pride. Major John Taylor understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent 23 years teaching history in Cleveland before the war. He stood in what had been a school in Frankfurt on September 7, 1945, looking at walls pocked with bullet holes and floors covered in broken glass and plaster dust. His assistant, Lieutenant Morrison, stood beside him, holding a clipboard. "The engineers say they can make it functional in 3 weeks, Morrison said. "Roof, windows, basic repairs. But, sir, we don't have teachers. We don't have books. We don't even have chalk that isn't Wehrmacht surplus." Taylor walked to a window frame without glass and looked out at the street where children were digging through rubble, looking for anything sellable or edible or burnable for warmth. A girl of perhaps 8 carried a brick twice as heavy as she should be able to lift. A boy, missing his left arm, directed 2 smaller children in salvaging bent nails from charred lumber. They worked with the efficiency of people far older, people who had learned too young that survival was labor. "How many children in this district?" Taylor asked. "Registration shows 4,200. "How many of their parents are dead?" Morrison consulted his clipboard. "We don't have exact estimate. Best guess, 20 to 30% have lost at least one parent. Maybe 10% are orphans." Taylor lit a cigarette, exhaled smoke into the October air. We're not just rebuilding schools, Morrison. We're rebuilding minds. Everything these children know is a lie. Their entire education has been 12 years of systematic poisoning. We have to extract the poison and replace it with something true. And we have to do it before they're old enough to be beyond saving. With respect, sir, that sounds like... Like what? Like indoctrination. Taylor turned from the window. It is indoctrination. But toward what? Toward the radical idea that all humans have equal value. That evidence matters more than mythology. That disagreement doesn't require genocide. If that's indoctrination, then guilty is charged. The program Taylor designed over the following weeks was both practical and revolutionary. The Army Corps of Engineers would repair school buildings on a priority basis, ahead of all reconstruction, except hospitals and water treatment. The Army would provide hot meals to every child who attended school: soup, bread, occasionally meat. Always more calories than most German families could manage. This was strategic. Hungry children don't learn, and their parents needed incentive to send them to school, rather than put them to work scavenging. But the core challenge remained: what to teach them, and who would do the teaching. The textbook solution was elegant in its audacity. The Army contracted with American publishers to create entirely new textbooks in German, written specifically for this purpose. Mathematics books that taught arithmetic through rebuilding calculations: how much cement for a wall, how many bricks for a house. Geography books that presented the world as it actually existed, with Germany as one nation among many rather than the center of everything. History books that told the truth about the war, about the camps, about what had been done in the German people's name. Biology books that presented actual science rather than racial pseudoscience. By October of 1945, 300,000 of these textbooks had arrived in the American zone. By January of 1946, the number would reach 3 million. They were shipped in trucks with military priority, distributed to schools with the same care as ammunition or medical supplies, because in a very real sense, they were weapons in a war against ignorance. Part 3. The sergeant and the boy, Kurt Schmidt, spent 6 weeks in an American military hospital, first in the field facility near Berchtesgaden, then in a larger installation in Munich. His leg healed slowly, the bone knitting itself back together with the help of American surgical skill and American antibiotics that German hospitals hadn't possessed in months. He walked on crutches, then with a cane, then with only a slight limp that the doctors said would fade with time. What didn't heal quickly was his understanding of the world. The hospital was full of contradictions he couldn't reconcile. The Negro orderly who brought him meals was unfailingly polite, asked him in broken German how he was feeling, adjusted his pillows. The Jewish doctor who checked on his progress never mentioned Kurt's Hitler Youth uniform, folded now in a box under his bed. The American nurses treated him exactly the same as they treated their own wounded soldiers, changed his bandages, brought him magazines, even sneaked him extra portions at meals. One day in early June, a Red Cross worker asked him what he planned to do after his discharge. Kurt, who was now 18 and technically an adult, though he felt anything but, admitted he didn't know. His father had been killed in the Ardennes. His mother and younger brother Friedrich lived in Munich, in an apartment that Kurt hoped still existed. He had no trade, no education beyond what the Hitler Youth had provided, no skills except for ones involving weapons and warfare. "Can you read?" the Red Cross worker asked. "Of course I can read," Kurt said, slightly offended. "Then you can finish school. The Americans are reopening schools. They're even providing lunch." Kurt's discharge papers came on June 15th. They gave him a set of civilian clothes, donated items, probably from America, trousers that were slightly too large and a shirt that was slightly too small, and a train pass to Munich. The Negro sergeant who had triaged him on that April day in the forest happened to be in the processing area when Kurt came through. He recognized Kurt immediately. "You're the kid with the leg," the sergeant said. "How is it?" "Better. Kurt said in English, surprising himself. The doctors, they saved it. I thought I would lose it. Nah, we got good docs. You got lucky. The sergeant paused. You know what you're gonna do now. Go home. My mother, she doesn't know if I'm alive. After that, I mean. Kurt shrugged, a gesture that encompassed his uncertainty about everything. The sergeant pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, wrote something on it. There's a school in your district. American-run, but German teachers. They're looking for older students to help with the younger kids. You'd get lunch, maybe a little pay, and you could finish your own education. He handed Kurt the paper. Address is there. Guy running it is a teacher from Chicago. Tell him Sergeant Lewis sent you. Kurt took the paper. Why are you helping me? Lewis considered this. Because you're a kid. Because the war's over. Because somebody's got to break the cycle. He held out his hand. Good luck, Kurt. Kurt shook the hand of the Negro sergeant, felt the firm grip, the calluses, the basic human warmth of palm against palm. He thought of all the things his Hitler youth leaders had told him about inferior races, about subhumans, about the necessity of maintaining purity. Then, he thought about who had saved his life and who had tried to teach him to end other people's lives. And he walked out of the hospital, toward whatever waited for him in the ruins of Munich. Part 4. October 15th. The school opened on October 15th, 1945, in what had been a furniture store before an American bomb had removed most of its roof and all of its inventory. Captain Margaret Burke, 38 years old, formerly a fourth-grade teacher at Jefferson Elementary in Philadelphia, stood in the doorway at 7:30 that morning and watched the children come. They arrived in clusters and alone, some accompanied by parents, most not. They wore whatever clothing they had, summer dresses in October cold, adult coats cut down to child size, shoes with soles tied on with string. A girl of perhaps 7 wore a coat made from a Wehrmacht blanket, the insignia carefully unpicked, but the Feldgrau color unmistakable. A boy arrived barefoot, his mother explaining in apologetic German that his shoes had been stolen and she had nothing to replace them with. Margaret counted them as they entered. 31, 58, 93. By 8 o'clock, when she was supposed to start, 127 children filled the space, sitting on improvised benches made from scavenged lumber, standing against walls, some of the smaller ones sitting on the floor. Ages ranged from 6 to 15. They watched her with expressions that ranged from hope to suspicion, to blank exhaustion. She had no textbooks. The shipment promised for this week had been delayed. She had chalk scraped from Wehrmacht supplies. She had paper, thin and grayish, also Wehrmacht surplus. She had her voice and her training and her desperate conviction that what happened in this room mattered more than most people would ever understand. Good morning, she said in German, which she had learned in college and refined during 3 months of intensive study before deployment. My name is Captain Burke. I am your teacher. This is your school. Starting today, you will learn. A hand went up. A boy of perhaps 12, thin and suspicious. Learn what? He asked. How to be American. Margaret had expected this. Learn how to read, how to calculate, how to think, how to ask questions and find answers, how to tell the difference between truth and lies. She paused. I can't teach you how to be American. I can only teach you how to be educated. We were educated, another voice said. Before. Before, you were trained, Margaret said. There's a difference. Training teaches you what to think. Education teaches you how to think. She picked up a piece of Wehrmacht chalk, wrote on the board. 2 + 2 = 4, several voices said. Right. That's training. You were trained to know that answer. Now, she erased it, wrote, if I have 2 apples and get 2 more, but I owe someone 3 apples, how many apples do I have left? Silence. Then slowly, Hands began to rise. "That's education," Margaret said. "That's thinking. That's what we're going to do here." The first day was chaos, but it was productive chaos. She divided them by age and approximate skill level, put the older children in charge of the younger ones, taught them songs in English because music was a language that crossed barriers. At noon, the army trucks arrived with the promised food. Vegetable soup, thick with potatoes and carrots, and bread, white bread, real bread, more bread than most of these children had seen in months. They ate in silence at first, too focused on food to speak. Then the talking began. About the soup, about the room, about the American teacher who spoke German like someone reading from a book. Margaret circulated among them, learning names, asking questions, beginning to understand the individual children who would fill this room. One girl, Liesel, 9 years old, could already read at a level far beyond her age. Her father had been a professor of literature before the war, had taught her from his library before the books were burned or confiscated. Now her father was in an American POW camp somewhere, and Liesel lived with an aunt who worked 14 hours a day, clearing rubble for 50 pfennigs and a meal. A boy named Otto, 14, couldn't read at all. He had been pulled out of school at 10 to work in a munitions factory, had spent 4 years assembling artillery shells 12 hours a day. His hands bore the scars of industrial accidents, missing parts of 3 fingers, burn marks from hot metal. He sat in the back and said nothing, but his eyes followed Margaret with an intensity that suggested desperate hunger for something beyond food. A pair of twins, Hans and Greta, 7 years old, had lost their parents in the bombing of Dresden. They had walked from Dresden to Munich, 60 miles, begging and scavenging. They sat pressed together like a single organism, sharing food from a single bowl, finishing each other's sentences. When Margaret asked their last name, they looked at each other in confusion. They had forgotten. By the end of the first day, Margaret was exhausted in a way that felt entirely different from physical tiredness. She had spent 8 hours trying to teach children who were variously traumatized, malnourished, illiterate, or some combination of all 3. She had broken up 2 fights, mediated 4 disputes, sent 1 boy to the army medic with what looked like the early stages of tuberculosis. She had taught maybe 30 minutes of actual content, but when she locked the door at 4 o'clock and turned to survey the empty room, she saw something that made the exhaustion worthwhile. On every surface, benches, walls, floor, children had written or drawn. Their names mostly, practiced over and over. Simple arithmetic. Drawings of houses and families and things they remembered from before the war. One child had written in careful block letters, "Today, I learned." Part 5. The textbooks arrive. 3 weeks later, on November 7th, the textbooks arrived. Kurt Schmidt, now working as a teaching assistant and continuing his own education in the evenings, was there when the army truck pulled up. He helped unload the wooden crates, each one stenciled with English words he now understood. Educational materials. Handle with care. They carried 23 crates into the school, stacked them in what served as Captain Burke's office, began prying them open with the care of people unpacking treasure. The books smelled new. That was the first thing Kurt noticed. The scent of fresh ink and paper, so different from the musty odor of the old textbooks he remembered from before. The ones with water damage and torn pages and decades of use. These books were pristine, their covers unblemished, their pages crisp. The second thing he noticed was the content. He picked up a history textbook, opened it at random, a chapter on the French Revolution, another on American independence, another on the unification of Italy. The section on Germany covered the Weimar Republic, the rise of National Socialism, the war. It was honest in a way that made Kurt's stomach clench. The photographs were brutal. Concentration camps, mass graves, destroyed cities. The text didn't soften anything. Between 1933 and 1945, the National Socialist government of Germany initiated a program of systematic genocide. Kurt had known about the camps. Everyone had known something, though the scale and nature of what had happened was only now becoming clear through newsreels and photographs and testimonies. But seeing it in a textbook, presented as historical fact alongside the French Revolution and the Roman Empire, made it real in a way that newsreels hadn't. This was what would be taught to German children. This was what he would help teach. He looked at a geography book. Germany was shown as it would exist after the peace treaties, smaller, divided, no longer the center of the map. France and Britain and America were given equal space, equal importance. There was a chapter on Africa that didn't mention colonial opportunities or racial hierarchies, just the actual geography, the cultures, the history. There was a chapter on Asia that presented Chinese and Japanese civilization as ancient and complex, not as threats or inferiors. The mathematics book was perhaps the most revolutionary because it was the most normal. No problems about calculating bomb trajectories or fighter plane fuel consumption, just mathematics. Pure, apolitical, universal. How to calculate the volume of a cylinder, how to figure percentages, how to solve for an unknown variable. The word problems involve building houses, planning gardens, calculating travel times. Normal things, peaceful things. Kurt carried a stack of these books into the main room, where the children were working on lessons. Captain Burke looked up, saw the books, and something in her expression shifted. Relief, maybe, or vindication. "The textbooks are here," Kurt said in English, which he now spoke with increasing confidence. "Then let's distribute them," Margaret said. She stood, called for attention. "Children, we have something for you, something important." They distributed the books one by one, calling each child forward, handing them their textbooks, mathematics, German literature, history, geography, depending on age and level. Kurt watched the children's faces as they received the books. Some were confused, holding them gingerly, as if unsure what to do with something so new and clean. Others opened them immediately, began flipping through pages, eyes widening at the photographs and diagrams. One girl, Margaret, 12 years old, opened her history book to a photograph of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The image showed skeletal prisoners, barely alive, staring at the camera with expressions beyond anything that should exist on human faces. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long moment, then closed the book carefully. Her hands shook. "This is what really happened?" she asked. "Yes," Margaret Burke said. "That's what really happened. They told us the camps were just for enemies of the state, for criminals and traitors. They said the prisoners were treated fairly." "They lied to you," Margaret said. She said it gently but without equivocation. "They lied about many things. These books tell the truth. It's not an easy truth. But you deserve to know it." Margaret opened the book again, looked at the photograph. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't look away. "My uncle was a guard at Dachau," she said. "He said he was just doing his duty. He said—" She stopped, unable to continue. "It's not your fault," Margaret said. "You were children. You believed what you were taught. But now you know better, and now you can choose what kind of person you want to be." That day, for the first time since the school opened, Margaret saw children crying over textbooks. Not from frustration or exhaustion, but from the collision of propaganda and truth, from the sudden understanding of how thoroughly they had been lied to and what those lies had enabled. The crying was grief and shame and rage and relief, all mixed together. Relief that they were finally being told the truth, even though the truth was almost unbearable. Part 6. The Sergeant from Chicago. Sergeant Robert Lewis arrived at the Munich school on a Thursday afternoon in late November. He wasn't there officially. The school was a military operation, but Lewis was with a different unit, stationed in the logistics division. He had heard about the school from Kurt, whom he'd sent there 6 months earlier, and wanted to see how the kid was doing. He found Kurt in the main room, working with a group of 7 younger children on basic arithmetic. The boy he had triaged in the forest, the Hitler youth soldier who had expected torture and death, now sat patiently explaining to a 6-year-old how to count by tens. The transformation was visible, not just in what Kurt was doing, but in how he moved, how he spoke. The rigid, frightened soldier had been replaced by someone looser, more open, more human. Kurt saw Lewis, excused himself, came over. "Sergeant, I didn't know you were coming. Just checking in," Lewis said, "making sure you didn't abandon the education thing and join a gang of rubble bandits." Kurt laughed. A real laugh, unforced. "The rubble bandits wouldn't have me. I'm too educated now." They talked for a few minutes, Kurt explaining the school's routine, the challenges, the small victories. Then Margaret Burke appeared, having heard that there was an American visitor. "You must be Sergeant Lewis," she said. "Kurt has mentioned you several times, has he?" Lewis shot Kurt an amused look. "Hope he said nice things. He said you saved his life, and then sent him here to save his mind." "I just gave him an address," Lewis said. "He did the rest." Margaret studied him for a moment, then made a decision. "We could use some help with the older students, English lessons specifically. They need to learn the language, and my accent is Philadelphia. Do you have any spare time?" Lewis considered this. His official duties ended at 5. The school ran until 6 for older students. "I could come a couple of evenings a week, but I'm not a teacher." "You don't need to be a teacher," Margaret said. "You just need to speak English and be willing to answer questions." So Sergeant Robert Lewis, who had grown up in the segregated South Side of Chicago, who had joined the Army because the factory jobs were closed to Negroes and military service, paid better than sharecropping, who had survived North Africa and Italy and France and Germany, became an evening volunteer teacher in a Munich school full of children who had been systematically taught that people like him were subhuman. The first evening was awkward. The older students, teenagers mostly, ages 13 to 17, filed in at 5:15 and stopped when they saw Lewis at the front of the room. Their faces showed everything they'd been taught and everything they were struggling to unlearn. Lewis decided to address it directly. "Good evening," he said in English. "I'm Sergeant Lewis. I'm going to help with your English lessons. I know what you're thinking. Some of you are thinking it louder than others." He paused. "Yes, I'm a Negro. Yes, my skin is dark. Yes. According to what you were taught, I'm supposed to be inferior to you, supposed to be less intelligent, less capable, less human." The silence was absolute. "Here's the thing," Lewis continued. "I read 7 books last month. I speak 2 languages. I can repair a Jeep engine, operate a radio, navigate by the stars, and I make a mean pot of gumbo. So I don't feel particularly inferior. And you're going to learn English from me, and maybe along the way you'll figure out that skin color doesn't tell you a damn thing about what's inside a person." He picked up a piece of chalk, wrote on the board. "My name is..." First lesson. How to introduce yourself in English. Repeat after me. "My name is..." They repeated it, hesitant at first, then more confidently. Lewis went around the room, had each student introduce themselves in English, corrected pronunciation, praised effort, treated them exactly like any teacher would treat any students. Kurt watched from the back, where he sat in on the lesson, while also helping with the younger students' homework. He saw how Lewis deflected their discomfort with casual competence, how he treated their attempts at English with respect, regardless of ability, how he made them laugh with self-deprecating stories about his own struggles. Learning German. After the lesson, as students filed out, Lewis pulled out a small record player he'd brought. Army surplus, portable, battery-powered. "Before you go," he said, "I want you to hear something." He put on a record. Music filled the room. Jazz, Louis Armstrong, the instrumental section of West End blues. The trumpet soared and dipped and climbed again, making melodies that seemed impossible, that sounded like laughter and crying at the same time. The students stopped, listened. Some of them had heard jazz before. It had been banned as degenerate Negro music, which had made it irresistible to some teenagers. But most had never heard anything like this combination of structure and chaos, this controlled wildness that seemed to contain more freedom than they had imagined music could hold. "That's Louis Armstrong," Louis said when the song ended. "Negro musician from New Orleans. Some people say he's the greatest trumpet player who ever lived. I won't argue with them." He packed up the record player. "See you next Tuesday." They left in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd arrived with. Part 7. 6 months later. By May of 1946, the Munich school had become something more than an educational facility. It was a community center, a feeding program, a counseling service, a jobs placement office, and occasionally a mediator in family disputes. The enrollment had grown to 218 children. 3 more teachers had been added. German teachers carefully vetted, trained in the new curriculum. The building had been properly repaired, with actual glass in the windows and a roof that didn't leak. Kurt Schmidt was no longer an assistant, but a junior teacher, working primarily with the middle-aged students while continuing his own advanced studies in the evening. He was 19 now, had gained 20 pounds since his days in the hospital, walked with barely a trace of a limp. He was considering university, maybe studying to become a real teacher, maybe history, maybe education itself. On a Tuesday evening in mid-May, after the older student's English lesson, Louis asked Kurt to stay behind. They sat in the classroom that had become familiar through repetition, surrounded by textbooks and student work and maps of a world that looked different than the maps Kurt had learned from as a child. "I'm being transferred," Louis said. "Back to the States, shipping out next month." Kurt felt something heavy settle in his chest. "Oh, yeah. End of my deployment. Time to go home." Louis leaned back in his chair. "I wanted to tell you personally, and I wanted to say, I'm proud of you, kid. You've come a long way from that forest in Bavaria." "You saved my life," Kurt said. "I made sure you got medical attention. The doctors saved your life. You saved your own life by choosing to live instead of giving up. You saved more than my life." Kurt struggled for words in English, switched to German, then back again. You showed me that everything I believed was a lie. That the people I was taught to hate were the people who would help me. That the world could be different than what they told me." "You figured that out yourself," Louis said. "I just gave you an opportunity. Will you come back? To Germany? Maybe. Someday. As a tourist, not a soldier." Louis smiled. "I'll want to see how you turned out. Make sure you didn't backslide into thinking Negroes are subhuman." Kurt laughed, but there were tears in his eyes. "I wrote an essay," he said suddenly, "for Captain Burke's class, about lies and truth and how lies can destroy a nation. She said it was good. She said I should keep writing, then keep writing, become a teacher, teach the next generation of German kids to think instead of just believe. Break the cycle." Louis stood, held out his hand. "It's been an honor, Kurt Schmidt." Kurt shook his hand, then impulsively pulled Louis into an embrace. They stood there for a moment, the Negro sergeant from Chicago's South Side and the former Hitler youth soldier from Munich. 2 people who should have been enemies, who had become something like friends, or maybe something like proof that people could change. Part 8. 50 years later. In the fall of 1995, Kurt Schmidt stood in front of a classroom in Munich, teaching history to a group of 16-year-olds. He was 67 now, had been teaching for 46 years, had educated 3 generations of German students. The classroom was modern, with computers and projectors and all the technology his first classroom had lacked. The textbooks were updated editions, but they still told the truth about the war, about the camps, about what had been done. On his desk was a photograph in a worn frame. Two men standing in front of a school building in Munich, 1946. One was a young Kurt, thin and serious. The other was Sergeant Robert Lewis, smiling, one arm around Kurt's shoulders. The photograph had been taken the day before. Lewis shipped out, had sat on Kurt's desk through 46 years of teaching. Today, Kurt told his students, "I want to tell you about my teacher." His name was Sergeant Robert Lewis, and he was the first Negro I ever met. I was taught to believe that Negroes were subhuman. I was taught to believe that anyone different from me was inferior. And then this man saved my life and taught me English and showed me what it means to be human. He told them the story he had told thousands of students before, about the forest, the hospital, the school, the textbooks, the jazz records, the gradual transformation of a boy who had been poisoned by propaganda into someone who could think critically and feel compassion. He told them because the story mattered, because they needed to hear it, because the antidote to hatred was always specific. Concrete examples of human decency, crossing whatever artificial boundaries people drew. When he finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Did you ever see him again?" "Sergeant Lewis. Once," Kurt said. "In 1957. He came back to Germany as a tourist, like he said he would. We spent a weekend together, talking about everything. He had become a teacher too in Chicago. He taught history to Negro children in a segregated school." Kurt paused. "He died in 1983. His daughter sent me a letter. At his funeral, she said, he had requested that they play Louis Armstrong. West End Blues." The classroom was silent. "The point," Kurt said, "is not that one American soldier was kind to me. The point is that I was taught lies about an entire group of people, and those lies made me capable of accepting terrible things. And then I met actual people from that group, and the lies collapsed. That's why education matters. That's why truth matters. That's why we study history, not to remember dates and names, but to remember that we're all capable of believing lies, and we're all responsible for seeking truth." After class, students filed out slowly, some stopping to look at the photograph on his desk. The last student to leave was a boy named Thomas, whose grandfather had also been in the Hitler Youth. Thomas stood by the desk, studying the photograph. "Can I ask you something, Herr Schmidt?" "Of course. Do you think, if you hadn't been wounded, if you hadn't been captured, if you hadn't met Sergeant Lewis, do you think you would have changed anyway?" Kurt considered this honestly. "I don't know," he said. "I'd like to think I would have. But maybe not. Maybe I needed that shock, that moment of having all my assumptions destroyed. Maybe we all need something like that, some experience that breaks through our certainty and forces us to actually think." Thomas nodded slowly, then left. Kurt stayed in the classroom, as he often did, looking at the photograph of himself and Robert Lewis, two young men in a ruined city, building something better from the rubble. Epilogue. The investment. By the end of 1946, more than 8,000 schools were operating in the American occupation zone. They taught nearly 3 million German children, children who would grow up to become the architects of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder, the European Union, children who would remember American soldiers repairing their school buildings, American teachers bringing textbooks, American sergeants teaching them English and playing jazz records. The investment in education was measured in millions of dollars, millions of textbooks, thousands of teachers and administrators and volunteers. It was criticized by some Americans as too generous, coddling the enemy, wasting resources on people who had just tried to conquer the world. But those critics missed the point entirely. The investment wasn't charity, it was strategic calculation. It was the understanding that Germany's future, and, by extension, Europe's future, depended on what those children learned. That the only way to prevent another war was to educate a generation that understood why the last war had happened, what lies had enabled it, what truths had been suppressed. The children who cried when they saw American textbooks in 1945 cried because those textbooks represented both the collapse of everything they'd been taught and the possibility of something better. They cried because truth, after 12 years of lies, was overwhelming. They cried because they had been given not just education, but the chance to become something other than what the Third Reich had tried to make them. And then they dried their tears, opened their textbooks, and began to learn. The story of Kurt Schmidt and Sergeant Robert Lewis was repeated thousands of times across the American zone, in thousands of schools with thousands of variations. An American teacher in Berlin who learned German folk songs and taught them to her students, a lieutenant in Frankfurt who organized a soccer league, a chaplain in Stuttgart who helped rebuild a bombed church and made it available for community meetings regardless of denomination, a corporal in Hamburg who taught art classes on weekends. They were all small acts in the larger project of reconstruction, but small acts repeated thousands of times became something larger, became the foundation of a relationship between former enemies, became proof that people could change, became hope that the future could be different than the past. The children of 1945 became the teachers, politicians, writers, and builders of post-war Germany. They remembered. They taught their own children to remember. And when they were old, they told stories about American soldiers who had showed them that humanity had no borders, that education mattered more than propaganda, that truth was worth crying for. Kurt Schmidt died in 2004, at the age of 76. At his funeral, his daughter played Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, just as he had requested. On his desk at home, they found 46 years of student essays, carefully preserved, and underneath them all, saved from 1946, his own essay, the one he had written for Captain Margaret Burke, the one she had kept until her death in 1989, and then returned to him with a note. This is where it started. This is proof that people can change. The essay was titled simply, How Lies Destroy Nations. It began, I was taught to hate. Then I met Sergeant Lewis, and he taught me to think. This is the story of the difference between those two things.